Hello, and welcome to another episode of Sermon Braindump. My name is Scott Dalen, an ELCA pastor in Southwest Iowa, and I present these videos every week for a couple of different reasons. One is just to pull my brain out of the mode of background work as I ponder and work with a text over the course of the week and move into what I call sermonation mode as I actually write and prepare the sermon that I will preach to my congregation for the weekend. That's the first reason. And the second reason is just to kind of help you, the viewer, who have come across this for whatever reason, to gain a little different insight into the assigned gospel text for the week. That is why I do it. And so here we go. Now, this particular Sunday, which is February 21st, 2016, the second Sunday in Lent, the assigned gospel text comes out of Luke chapter 13, verses 31 through 35. Now, this is a very brief little snippet of gospel, kind of found in the midst of Jesus' ministry. He is aiming himself towards Jerusalem, knowing overarching what his final mission is and where it will lead and where it will culminate and what it will culminate in with his death and eventual resurrection there in Jerusalem. That's what we're moving towards as we are here in the season of Lent, and everything continues to move that direction as the season itself continues to get darker and darker and darker as the opposing forces around Jesus continue to ramp up. That's kind of where we're at in the season and where this small little snippet comes from. Again, it's very brief. Typically, our gospel lessons are a little bit longer, but that's okay. It's just an interesting little look into what's going on within the context of Jesus' ministry and why we hit it now during the season and such. So that's kind of what's going on. In terms of what Jesus is up to, in addition to moving towards Jerusalem, as I mentioned, he's just been still teaching. This particular portion of Luke, we see a lot of different parables, a lot of just different teaching moments, a lot of different interactions when he is teaching the people that are around him, those that he's encountering, as well as those who are following him. It's kind of all wrapped up together. And we continue to see hints about who he is as the Messiah and what that truly means. That this is not just an earthly political figure as the messiahs of the past had been. If you're familiar, a messiah is one anointed to be God's leader. And typically that was the kings back in the Old Testament time, which is important, and we'll kind of come around to that too once we get into the passage. But that's what continues to happen here in the as Jesus moves towards Jerusalem, as his face is set towards Jerusalem, and that important work that will go on there, tricky and frightening as that must have been for him. So that's kind of the background of what's going on. So let's go ahead and jump in. So basically, Jesus is in the midst of teaching, and we hear, at that very hour, some Pharisees came and said to him, "Get away from here, for Herod wants to kill you." He said to them, "Go and tell that fox for me, listen, I am casting out demons and performing cures today and tomorrow, and on the third day I will finish my work. Yet today, tomorrow, and the next day I must be on my way, because it is impossible for a prophet to be killed outside of Jerusalem. Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to it. How often have I desired to gather your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, and you were not willing. See, your house is left to you, and I tell you, you will not see me until the time when you say, 'Blessed is the one who comes in the name of the Lord.'" Okay, so kind of two different little portions are present within this short passage. One is unique. The first part, the whole thing between the Pharisees and talking about Herod and Jesus kind of sniping back about Herod, that part is unique to Luke. This is the only gospel where we hear this little portion. Then the second part, the lament over Jerusalem, it's called, that's also present in Matthew's gospel, and then here in Luke, and they are almost verbatim identical. Matthew has like one little tiny addition within one phrase, and that's the only difference. It's thought that that portion comes from the source Q. If you've heard me talk about that, Q is an unknown, unfound scriptural source or gospel source that was used by the author of Matthew and Luke and we see that in some similarities that they both possess that Matthew or that Mark does not have. So it's thought that they have this similar source that they both used as they were putting it together. But excuse me. So okay, all of that being said, what's going on here? First, we have this interesting encounter between Jesus and some Pharisees. And typically, when we hear about the Pharisees, we hear about them being in opposition to Jesus, typically, not always, but usually. However, there were a contingent of these religious elite that were at least tracking Jesus and were kind of following along and were interested in what he was saying. The most famous of these being Nicodemus, which we hear about in John's Gospel, being one who comes to Jesus to learn from him and eventually comes around to support him. And so it is possible, even though we typically think of the Pharisees as the biblical bad guys here within the Gospels and the ones who are simply opposing Jesus because of his threat to their status, it seems, at least here, we have this little snippet of maybe we've got a group of Pharisees who are in support of Jesus and are warning him that Herod is after him. So they're saying, hey, maybe you should go and hide. That's one thought. The other side of things is that or the other thought is that they were sent by Herod to warn him, like, I'm coming for you. And so they are here with a dire warning and not so much a friendly suggestion of, hey, maybe you better watch out. We don't know. It could be either way. But what's interesting is that we hear, yet again, the powers that be, and in this case, it's Herod, who is the quote-unquote king, are gunning for Jesus. Why is that? Well, Jesus seemed to represent within this great reversal that God is up to within our reality. That he was a threat to the power. Those that held the power in the world wanted to hold on to it, and we still see that today. That the powers that be want to hold on to the power that they have. Well, Herod had political power. The Pharisees often, maybe not in this particular case, but the Pharisees had the religious power, the religious respect, because they were the best and brightest. The chief priests, those in the temple, they also had some of that religious and probably some political influence as well that they didn't want to give up on. And so we tend to see that those who are opposing Jesus do so because he represents a threat to their status quo that they don't want to give up on. And I think that's what's going on here with Herod. Now, we see once Jesus hears, well, Herod's after you, I'm immediately reminded of the encounter with Herod and John. So often Jesus is confused with John the Baptist and vice versa, that it definitely puts that in mind. Even Herod hears reports about Jesus, and some say it's John the Baptist, and that's when we always hear, well, John, I killed John. And John, his death at the hands of Herod, or the order of Herod anyway, is another example of that threat to power. John spoke out publicly against Herod and his wife Herodias, who was actually the wife of Herod's brother Philip. And that was a big no-no according to the law, because Philip was still alive. But because of this, Herod had John imprisoned. He was thrown in prison, and Herodias conspired and ended up getting him killed because he threatened their status, he threatened their reputation, he threatened all of that. So John has died, and now we hear later on that now Herod is threatening Jesus. Now, giving a little tiny bit more background as I think about it, why is that important? Why would Herod have power? The area that he, quote unquote, ruled included Galilee, which is Jesus' home stomping grounds, and so often we hear that he's active in Galilee. That's where a lot of his ministry happens. So he would Jesus being there would fall under Herod's jurisdiction. Now, I'll admit, I don't know exactly how the whole power structure worked between the king, who was essentially supported and appointed by Rome, and then the Roman government, which would have included, of course, Pilate, who was the governor of that region. Um, and so, admittedly, I don't know exactly how that works, but it seems that Herod has some power, just as his father, who was Herod the Great, had power about the time Jesus was born. And we see that exercised when Herod orders the death of the children 2 years and under within this specific area, this specific region. Um, so clearly, there's still some political uh, power going on. And if so, are they did they pay tribute to Rome as we have seen in some of the Old Testament times? Maybe, I don't know. Again, I don't know. I could probably research that, and maybe at some point I should. But somehow there is an aspect of power that Herod doesn't want to give up, and Jesus is apparently a threat to it, because with a following, he could create an uprising. This is always the fear for Rome, that there would be an uprising, particularly for Pilate. We see that again when we get to the Passover. That's why Pilate is there with all these extra Roman guards, because of the festival. There's so many Jewish people there, and if there's a riot or a revolt, this is where it's going to start. So we kind of see that aspect. Perhaps this is just a little bit of foreshadowing for what's going to come later. Herod does pop up later within the trial of Jesus here in Luke. So we'll see that again, that Jesus is sent off to Herod, who then sends him back to Pilate. And they're basically kind of like, after mocking him, they really don't do much. So all of this is kind of going on. And yet Jesus snipes back about Herod, and and there's kind of two trains of thought, and we get these words of, I do my work today and tomorrow, and on the third day it will be completed. Well, that's definitely some foreshadowing towards the resurrection being on the third day. But we see here that Jesus, his work, his goal, his mission, whatever you want to call it, is known to him, and he will not be deterred from it. He's not going to be threatened. He's not going to be bullied or scared into running away from it. So Jesus is showing courage towards his mission, knowing that it will end in his torture and death, which he's already talked about in the scripture, and we'll talk about again. Even though he knows that's coming, he still is not going to be deterred from it. He will continue on and go to Jerusalem. That brings us to the lament over Jerusalem. And what's he really talking about there? Now, again, I mentioned that portion is in Matthew without the little snipe about Herod, and it's just about Jerusalem. And it's interesting. There's this great history of Jerusalem killing prophets. Now, at the same token, plenty of prophets died outside of Jerusalem, so I don't exactly know why that's in there. And one of my professors, Old Testament professors that I heard in a podcast this week, said the exact same thing. So I'm like, hey, good, it's not just me thinking that. But many prophets, when the prophets were prominent, was at about the same time as the time period of the kings. We see the prophets really come into prominence and activity about the same time that the period of the judges comes to a close and we move into the period of the kings. And the prophets were the voice of God, oftentimes speaking out against the monarchy because the monarchy was failing and leading the people astray. And so it was dangerous for a prophet to speak out about the king, and because, as we see with Herod and John, kings have power. They can kill you. And so I think that's a lot of what's going on here and what Jesus is kind of alluding to. But it's interesting as Jesus talks about, how many times have I desired to gather your children together, the children of Jerusalem, the innocents within Jerusalem, which we will see them gather around Jesus at the triumphal entry coming up in a few more weeks. But also just the children of Israel, the children who have been led astray, the innocents who have been led astray by the various kings, the various monarchs, the various flawed entities of power. He desires to gather them together. Now, interesting side note, and just a little snippet here. This is one of the times when we hear a feminine illusion of the nature of God, gathering like a hen gathers her brood under her wings, and that's always important to note. So often we have the masculine image of God, and much of Scripture is aimed that way. But we have these little snippets of the feminine as well, and they're good and they're important to note because we remember that both male and female were made in the image of God. And it's not that males are prominent and females aren't, even though so much of our history has gone that direction. There's definitely a push within the church of inclusion and recognizing the importance of the feminine aspects of God as well. And so this is one of those little snippets. Now, I'm not thinking of going that direction with my sermon, but I wanted to bring it up that this is one, and Jesus says it, like, I want to gather you together as a mother protects her young, because we are all children of God. God is the perfect parent, the parent that we all hope to be and that we all hope to have, but we all fall short as parents, or our parents do, and not from bad intention. It just does, because we're not perfect. So we have this image of a perfect parent that Jesus desires. And now I'm going to come back around and try and tie all this up for what's going on here. So I think we have this image of Herod, or this little snippet about Herod, because Jesus is coming to rescue his children, to rescue the children of God in a way that the kings cannot. That's why we hear about the lament over Jerusalem, which has killed so many prophets. That they have spoken out the voice of God crying in the wilderness, if you will, as they speak out against the powers that be that have led the people astray, continuing to try and guide and be the ultimate perfect leader for us in God, which is what God intended for us in the first place. That's dangerous, again, and it's the powers that be that will hope to cling to their power, even though the work that Jesus will complete in Jerusalem, which he's foreshadowing here, is going to usher in some of this great reversal. Now, is it done yet? Well, yes and no. And that's always frustrating. But yes, in the terms that Jesus' work is done. He has completed it in the cross. It has been fulfilled in the resurrection. And that's all. That is done. And we hear that. It is finished. But the aspects of darkness are still present in this world. And it will not be until the second coming of Christ, when the new heaven and the new earth is made, whatever that's going to look like, that it will finally be over. That these powers that still fight tooth and nail to cling to us and to dissuade us, to displace us. The word that I'm really looking for is escaping me. But all those things that are still active and present in this world one day will be no more. The work is done, and yet the work is not done. And I know that's weird. It's just weird, and we don't get that, and that's okay. It's one of those things that we accept on faith, on the hope that God's promises are true, trusting that they are. Okay, so that's what's happening in this short passage. Looking at my clock, I'm amazed that I've talked this long over 6 short verses where not a whole lot is going on, but as per usual, Scripture, a lot goes on even when a lot doesn't seem to be going on. If you have thoughts, questions, comments, by all means share them, and we'll continue the conversation that way. Otherwise, I hope you have a blessed week, and we will catch you next time.